Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video we're going to talk about how to know God exists. The conventional wisdom in our society is that God does not exist. Furthermore, the conventional wisdom says there's no evidence for the existence of God, and the conventional wisdom says it is foolish to believe in God. Unfortunately, Christianity in general does not have an answer to this. Many, if not most Christians, are not able to articulate why they believe in God. Thus, they are not able to go out and persuade others that God exists. Because of that, many Christians even have doubts themselves whether or not God actually exists. In this video, we're going to learn how to know God exists. We're going to learn that there is indeed sufficient evidence for the existence of God. I'm going to give you 3 ways to demonstrate that God exists. Hopefully that'll help you to be confident that God exists. Also, it'll be something that you can use to persuade others that God exists. We're also going to learn that it is indeed wise to believe in God. Those of us who believe in God are in a minority in our culture, but that doesn't mean that we are wrong. And we're going to learn that indeed those of us who believe in God are actually the wise ones in our society. We're also going to look at some objections. If there is sufficient evidence for the existence of God, then why do so many people not believe in the existence of God? What are their objections to the existence of God? And we'll take a look at that. And then finally, we're going to think about this from God's perspective. And what I mean by that is, look at it this way. Imagine someone claims that you do not exist. How would you respond to them? What would you put forth as an answer to prove your existence? Well, the same thing with God. If God does indeed exist, what is His answer? What is His reply to those who claim that He does not exist? Now, before we get into that, let's talk about whether or not this matters. Humans have been debating the existence of God for centuries, and we put a lot of time and effort and energy into this debate. Now, if we're going to spend this much time and energy debating the existence of God, perhaps we should talk about whether or not it even matters. Does it matter if God exists? Let me start to answer that by thinking about some animals. Imagine some animals out in the wilderness. This might be the jungles of South America, perhaps the plains or savanna of Africa. In that environment, those animals are free. They have no restrictions. They have no boundaries. They can go where they want. They can come and go as they please. Contrast that with animals in a zoo. In that environment, animals are not free. There are walls and fences and gates and enclosures that restrict the animals, and the animals cannot come and go as they please. Now, when we ask whether or not God exists, we're asking a question about human existence. We're asking whether being a human is more like being an animal in a zoo or being an animal out in the wilderness. Part of the definition of the term God is a living being who's big enough and powerful enough to place restrictions on humans. And so when we ask if God exists, what we're really asking is if there is a living being out there somewhere who can place restrictions on humans. Now this comes into play, this affects humans in regards to life expectancy. For decades, for centuries, humans have been trying to increase life expectancy. There's been attempts to find the fountain of youth. There's been a lot of medical research to eradicate disease and increase life expectancy. But if there is a God, then by definition we're saying that there's a living being out there who actually controls life expectancy, and there may be a limit as to how much humans can increase our life expectancy. This also affects space travel. For decades, humans have been pushing a limit, have been pushing into space. We've sent men to the moon. There's talk of sending men to Mars. But if there is a God, then by definition that God has the ability to limit humans, and He has the ability to limit our ability to travel and explore space. Now let's talk about athletes. Imagine some athletes get together to play a game on the playground. In that environment, the athletes are free to set their own rules, and they need to police themselves, and there's no consequences for breaking the rules. Contrast that with athletes who play a game as part of a league. In that environment, there's a governing body who has established a rule book and they have also hired officials to enforce the rules, and if the athletes break the rules, there are consequences. Now again, when we ask whether God exists, we're asking a question about human existence. Is being a human more like being an athlete in a league or an athlete on the playground? Part of the definition of the term God is a living being who has established rules for humans to follow and who has the power and authority to enforce those rules and bring consequences on humans when we disobey those rules. And so when we ask if God exists, what we're really asking is if there's a living being out there somewhere who can tell humans how to live, just as a league can tell athletes how to play a game. Now this comes into play with humans in regards to gay marriage. For several decades now, there's been a concerted effort to legalize gay marriage and legitimize gay marriage. But if there is a God out there, then by definition, he has the power and authority to tell humans whether or not gay marriage is okay or not okay. Also, gender. In recent years, there's been a concerted effort to redefine gender. But again, if there is a God, then he has the power and authority to tell humans how to define gender. Now let's think about ants. When ants are underground in their ant nest, they are the largest creatures in that environment. Contrast that with ants who come above ground and crawl across a picnic table when humans are sitting there. In that environment, ants are not the biggest creature. In fact, they're very tiny compared to the humans. And the humans are so big that the humans can take their hand and crush and kill the ants at will. Now when we ask if God exists, we're asking a question about human existence. We're asking if being a human is more like being an ant in the ant nest, or is it more like being an ant on a picnic table? By definition, a God is a living being who is big enough to crush and kill humans at will. And so when we ask if God exists, we're asking if there is a living being out there somewhere who can crush and kill humans just as easily as humans can crush and kill ants. Now this affects us in regards to weather forecasting. For decades, scientists have been studying the weather and they've been trying to learn how to predict the weather. When will storms come? Where will those storms go? How strong will those storms be? But if there is a God out there, then by definition, God can control the storm, and he can increase or weaken the strength of a storm. He can dictate where the storm goes, and so that would limit the ability of humans to learn to forecast weather events. Likewise with disease. For decades, humans have been studying disease, and we've been trying to come up with vaccines to prevent disease and cures to cure disease. But again, if God exists, and by definition, he is big and powerful enough to control disease, in which case there's a limit to human ability to prevent disease and also cure disease. And finally, let's think about trees. When trees grow in a forest, they grow and they die of natural causes, and then they decay and fade away to nothing. Contrast that with trees that are grown on a plantation. In that environment, the trees are planted, they are cultivated. When they are fully grown, they are harvested, and then the plantation workers decide what to do with those trees. Some of the trees might get turned into furniture, others might get turned into lumber to be used to build a house. Some of the trees might simply be burned up. Now again, when we ask if God exists, we're asking a question about human existence. Is being a human more like being a tree on a plantation or a tree in the forest? Part of the definition of the term God is a living being who is big enough and powerful enough to determine when humans die, and also big and powerful enough to determine what happens to humans after we die. And so when we ask if God exists, what we're really asking is there a living being out there somewhere who determines what happens to humans after we die? Is there a living being out there somewhere who gives humans an existence after life here on earth and dictates what happens to us after life here on earth, just as the plantation workers dictate what happens to the trees after they are harvested? Now this affects us humans in regards to heaven. This has to do with whether or not heaven even exists. And if so, what is heaven like? Also, the existence of hell. When we ask whether God exists, part of that is asking whether or not there really is a hell, and what is hell like? And what or who or how is it determined whether humans go to heaven or hell? So again, when we ask, does it matter if God exists? It has to do with limits. Are there limits on human activity, or are we free to do what we want? Is there a living being out there who brings consequences on humans when we break God's rules? It has to do with danger. Is there a living being out there who is big enough and powerful enough to kill humans at will? And finally, it has to do with eternity. What happens to humans after life here on earth? Is there an existence after life here on earth? And so, looking at this, we see that yes, indeed, it does matter whether or not God exists. Now, before we talk about how to know God exists, let me talk about visible versus invisible. And let's start with the bird's nest. Imagine a lady walks out of her house, out the front door of her house one morning, and she looks at the lamp beside her door, and there's a collection of twigs on top of the lamp. They are arranged in a circular pattern, and there's a concave impression on top of this collection of twigs. Then she looks down on the ground, and there's a lot of white spots on the ground beneath the lamp, and there's a lot of other debris there. Now, what would she conclude when she sees that? She would conclude that a bird had been there and built a bird's nest. Now, does that lady have to see the bird in order to know that the bird was there? No, she doesn't, because the evidence that she sees with her eyes tells her very clearly that a bird had been there and built a bird's nest. Now let's think about a prank. Imagine a man walks out of the front door of his house one morning, and out in his front yard are hundreds, if not thousands, of spoons sticking up out of the ground. Now, what would he conclude? He would conclude that a prankster had been there in the middle of the night, or perhaps a group of pranksters, and they had planted all these spoons in his front yard. Now, does he have to see the pranksters in order to know that they were there? No, he doesn't, because the evidence that he sees with his eyes tells him very clearly that somebody or a group of people had been there and planted all these spoons in his front yard. Now let's think about God. The conventional wisdom in our society is that we haven't seen God, therefore God doesn't exist. However, that's not a valid conclusion. Just as we don't have to see a bird in order to know that a bird had been there and built the bird's nest, and just as we don't have to actually see the pranksters in order to know that somebody had been there and pranked our house, likewise, we don't have to see God in order to know God exists if there is sufficient evidence to tell us that indeed there is a God. So with that as a background, let's talk about how to know God exists. And let me start with the story of a planetarium. Imagine a group of students goes on a field trip to a planetarium. And they walk into the planetarium, and it's this huge room, and there's this big yellow ball suspended in air right in the middle of the room, and that represents the sun. And then there's a lot of smaller balls suspended in air surrounding the big yellow ball, and they represent the various planets. And each of the balls representing planets is colored like the planet it represents. It is sized in proportion to the planet it represents. It is spaced away from the yellow ball in proportion to the planet that it represents. And all these smaller balls move around the big yellow ball in proportion to the speed with which the planets move around the sun. And so the students walk in and they see this and they look at this for a while, and after a while one of the students asks, "Who built this?" Now think about what the student asked. The student asked who. The student didn't ask how did this come into existence. And in fact, if someone would tell the student, or if someone would tell you that a storm or tornado came through the area and blew a bunch of debris around, and after a while this planetarium just kind of appeared, you would not believe them. Because we know, using logic and intelligence, that the only way a planetarium like that comes into existence is if a living, intelligent being designs and creates it. Now, if that's the conclusion when we look at planetarium, should we not also conclude the same thing when we look at the real thing, the solar system? Just as the planetarium is a collection of round objects that move around in a regular, predictable pattern, so too the solar system is a collection of objects that are suspended in space and they move around in a regular, predictable pattern. And just as we look at a planetarium and come to the logical, intelligent conclusion that a living, intelligent being created the planetarium, so too when we look at the solar system, the logical, intelligent conclusion is that a living, intelligent being created the solar system. Now let's think about a biosphere. Imagine some astronauts are moving across the surface of the moon exploring. And after a while they come across this huge glass dome. And inside this glass dome they see people and buildings and plants and animals. And inside this glass dome is the right air mixture, the right food supply, the right temperature for humans to live and work. Now, let's think about how that biosphere came into existence. If somebody told you the storm went racing across the moon and magically created this biosphere that has the right temperature and air mixture and food supply for humans to live, would you believe them? No, because we know that it takes a living, intelligent being or group of living, intelligent beings to create an environment on the moon that has the right temperature, the right air mixture, and the right food supply for humans to live and work. Now, if that's the conclusion that we come to about a biosphere on the moon, should we not come to the same conclusion about planet Earth? Planet Earth is a biosphere. It has the right air mixture, it has the right temperature, it has the right food supply for humans to live and work. And just as we look at a biosphere on the moon and come to the logical, intelligent conclusion that a living, intelligent being created that biosphere, so too when we look at the Earth, the logical, intelligent conclusion is that a living, intelligent being created planet Earth. Now let's think about an artificial hand. Imagine a soldier is off at war and during a battle he loses his hand. And so he's brought home, he's taken to the hospital, and the surgeons give him an artificial hand. And this is a very advanced artificial hand. With this artificial hand, the soldier can pick up a pen and write. With this artificial hand, the soldier can pick up a ball and throw it. And with this artificial hand, the soldier can type on a keyboard. Now, if somebody told you that a tornado went through a junkyard and blew a lot of metal around and this artificial hand magically assembled itself out of the storm, would you believe that? No, you wouldn't. Because the logical, intelligent conclusion when we look at an artificial hand is to come to the conclusion that a living, intelligent being created the artificial hand, designed it and created it. And if that's the conclusion we come to when we look at an artificial hand, should we not come to the same conclusion when we look at the real thing, when we look at a real human hand? The human hand can pick up a pen and write, it can pick up a ball and throw it, and it can type on a keyboard. And so, if the logical, intelligent conclusion when looking at an artificial hand is to conclude that a living, intelligent being created it, then when we look at a real human hand, also the logical, intelligent conclusion is that a living, intelligent being created the human hand, which means a living, intelligent being created humans, which means the logical, intelligent conclusion is that God exists. Now, so far, I've used observation, logic, and intelligence to demonstrate how to know that God exists. When we look at our fellow humans, when we look at the planet that we live on, when we look at the solar system that we're a part of, the logical, intelligent conclusion is that there has to be a living, intelligent being out there somewhere who created us and everything that we see around us. Now, this is known as the argument from design or design theory. Now, the next step, which we're not going to get into in this video, but once we've established the fact that there has to be a God, the next step would be to decide, well, which of the many gods in our world is the correct God? Or what is God like? Where is God now? What does God want? That would be the next step, but that's beyond the scope of this video. In this video, I merely want to establish the fact that when we look at our fellow humans, when we look at the earth that we live in, and when we look at the solar system, the logical, intelligent conclusion has to be that there is a living, intelligent being out there somewhere who created us and the world, And that means that the logical, intelligent conclusion is that yes, indeed, God does exist. Now, as I said, this is known as argument from design, or the design theory, and it's based on observation, logic, and intelligence. Now, atheists don't like this idea. They reject argument from design. Unfortunately, there's Christians also who reject this idea. There's Christians that argue that that design theory is not sufficient evidence for the existence of God. And so what I want to do now is look at this from God's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, if someone claimed that you did not exist, what would your response be to that? How would you go about demonstrating to someone that you do indeed exist? And so what we're going to look at now is God's response to those who claim that He doesn't exist. And we're going to do that by looking at some verses in the Bible. Now, the Bible is divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament tells us about events from the beginning of time up to about 400 BC. The New Testament tells us about events from the 1st century AD. And this chart represents the New Testament. As I said, it covers events in the 1st century AD. The first 4 books of the New Testament tell us about the life of Jesus. The rest of the New Testament tells us about the establishment and the growth of the church. And as part of that, God used multiple men to write letters to various churches in the 1st century AD, giving them guidelines and instruction and wisdom and commands. And one of those books that he had written was the book of Romans. It was written by Paul. And in the book of Romans, God deals with this question of how to know God exists. And so let's take a look at that. It's found in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So notice it says that God's existence is clearly seen, and is clearly seen through what has been made. And that's what I was illustrating with my stories about the planetarium, the biosphere on the moon, and also the artificial hand. Now, notice it talks about His invisible attributes. And again, I illustrated this with the bird's nest and the prankster. Just as we don't need to see the bird in order to know that a bird had been there and built a bird's nest, and likewise, we don't have to actually see the pranksters in order to know that they had been there and planted spoons in our yard, so too, we don't necessarily have to see God in order to know that He exists. And so that's why it says here that God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. Now it also talks about God's power. God's power is clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. Let me illustrate that this way. Imagine the largest bird's nest. Bird's nests, some large birds can actually build nests that are, multiple feet in diameter, which is pretty big for a bird's nest. But now imagine the largest man-made building, a large house or skyscrapers. And if you compare those two, the man-made building is far bigger, much larger than the largest bird's nest that's ever been created. Now, that tells us that humans are much bigger, much stronger, and much more intelligent than birds. Now think about the largest man-made object compared to objects that God has made. The largest man-made object might be something like a skyscraper or an aircraft carrier, maybe an Egyptian pyramid or the Great Wall of China. And those are big objects and they are impressive, but they are small and tiny compared to planet Earth. If you look at a picture of the Earth that was taken from the moon, you can clearly see the Earth, but you can't see a single man-made object on that picture, because every man-made object, even the largest man-made object ever created, is small and tiny compared to planet Earth. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that God is much bigger and much more powerful, much more intelligent than humans. Just as the size of man-made objects compared to objects made by birds illustrates how much more powerful and intelligent humans are compared to birds, so too the objects that God has created are much bigger than the largest man-made objects, and so that tells us that God is much more powerful and much more intelligent than all of humanity put together. And so that's why it says here, God's power is clearly seen through what has been made. Notice also it says God's divine nature is clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. And so the fact that God exists is clearly seen. Notice also the word evident, and that word appears twice. That which is known about God is evident, for God made it evident. Again, the conventional wisdom in our society is that God does not exist, and the conventional wisdom also says there's no evidence for the existence of God. But this states very clearly, God has told us very clearly here, that God's existence is evident, and God has made it evident to us. Now, notice it says without excuse. And I want to make 3 comments about this. Again, part of the conventional wisdom in our society is that people say that that the design theory or the argument from design is not sufficient evidence to prove the existence of God. But when it says that they are without excuse, I believe what this is telling us is that the argument from design is sufficient evidence to prove the existence of God. Because when it says they are without excuse, the reason they are without excuse is because the existence of God is clearly seen through what has been made. So that tells us that the argument from design is sufficient evidence for the existence of God. A second thing to think about this is atheists and agnostics are going to stand in front of God someday. And I would assume when they're standing in front of God, they're going to start making excuses as to why they didn't believe in the existence of God. And it might be something like they never saw God, or God didn't appear personally to them, or something like that. But based on this verse, I believe God is going to tell the atheists and agnostics that they are without excuse. He's going to tell them that there is no excuse for them not to have believed in the existence of God, because the existence of God is clearly seen through what has been made. And then finally, I believe that this tells us that this is God's final answer to atheists and agnostics. And if that's God's final answer to them as to how they should know that He exists, should this not also be the argument that we resort to, that we really emphasize in order to explain to others why we believe the existence of God, and also the argument that we rely on to persuade others that God exists? Because again, God said that His existence is clearly seen through what has been made, and that means that every human is without excuse. So that tells me that this is the argument from design. The design theory is the argument for the existence of God that we need to emphasize and rely on in order to persuade others that God does indeed exist. Now let's continue reading there at the top at verse 21. Even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Now notice it says, professing to be wise, they became fools. In our society, the atheists and agnostics think they are being very wise when they deny the existence of God. This says that they are fools. And the reason they are fools is because they are not drawing the logical, intelligent conclusion from all the evidence that is right in front of them. Let me illustrate it this way. Imagine an evolutionist and his son are walking down the beach, and they come across a sandcastle. And this is a fabulous sandcastle. There's 4 towers, there's an inner wall, there's an outer wall, there's a moat, there are gates, there's all sorts of detail in this sandcastle, and it's just a fabulous sandcastle. And so the son starts looking around trying to figure out who built this thing, because he's very impressed, and he wants to talk to the person that built it, because it's a very impressive structure. Meanwhile, the evolutionist tells his son that there is no creator, there is no builder. Instead, the ocean waves came in at high tide and moved some sand around, and then at the next high tide, the water moved some more sand around, and that happened over a period of time, and eventually this sandcastle appeared. Now, is it wise and intelligent to believe that a sandcastle came into existence just by the action of the waves and the water? No, that's not a wise conclusion. That's a very foolish conclusion. Because we as humans know that the only way that a sandcastle like that comes into existence is if a living, intelligent being created the sandcastle. And likewise, when evolutionists look at humans and the world that we live in and try to tell us that all of this came into existence by chance and over time, and that time and chance just gradually formed us and that we evolved, that's a very foolish argument to make, because the logical, intelligent conclusion is to look at humanity and the earth that we live in and come to the conclusion that a living, intelligent being created the earth, the solar system, and us humans. And so again, what this is telling us here is atheists and agnostics, those who deny the existence of God, they think they are very wise, but the reality is they are fools. Now let's go back to the beginning, and let me start reading there again at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And notice it says suppress the truth. Those who deny the existence of God are suppressing the truth. And I saw an example of this when I was in college. I was at a debate down in Philadelphia. It was a debate between a creationist and an evolutionist. And the format of the debate was each man had a period of time to present his argument, and then they had some time to rebut the argument of the other person. Then they had some time to restate their case, and then there was some question and answer at the end. And the creationist, when it was his turn to present his case, he based his argument on what he called specific creativity. And he illustrated that with Mount Rushmore and the Man on the Moon. Mount Rushmore is 4 faces that look like 4 specific individuals. The Man on the Moon is merely a face that just kind of vaguely, kinda resembles a human face. Now, we as humans know that a living, intelligent being created Mount Rushmore. Whereas we humans would believe that the Man on the Moon came into existence by, storms just kind of blowing some dirt and sand around, and maybe some erosion, and eventually some colors and shapes appeared that just vaguely resemble a human face. So when we look at Mount Rushmore, we say, well, a living, intelligent being had to have created that, whereas Mount Rushmore is whereas the Man on the Moon is something that could have come into existence by chance. Now, Mount Rushmore has specific creativity. The Man on the Moon does not. Anything that has specific creativity had to have been created by a living, intelligent being. So then the creationists went on to explain how human DNA has specific creativity, and so then the conclusion is that humans had to have been created by a living, intelligent being. So that was the argument of the creationist. Then it was the turn for the evolutionist to present his case, and he started off by going on this long diatribe about how this debate was very unfair, and the agreement had been that they were going to exchange information beforehand so that they could properly prepare for rebuttal. But he claimed the creationist has never sent the information, and this debate was very unfair. It was rigged against him. And he went on and on and on like this. Then he eventually got around to presenting his case. And I'm a fairly intelligent guy, but I have no idea what he said. He used a lot of big terms and big, long, fancy words, and I have no idea what he said. Then it was time for rebuttal, and during rebuttal, the creationist said he had indeed sent the information, and he said if he had known that the evolutionist had not received it, he gladly would have sent it again, and then he went on to present his rebuttal. When it was time for the evolutionist to present his rebuttal, he started throwing a lot of transparencies up on the screen. Now, this is back in the day of overhead projectors and transparencies, but the evolutionist started putting a lot of transparencies up on the screen to rebut what the creationist had said. He even had some transparencies specifically designed to rebut the whole thing about Mount Rushmore and the Man on the Moon. And so those of us in the audience are looking at each other and asking the obvious question. Well, if the evolutionist had not gotten the information beforehand, how did he have all these transparencies prepared? And so it was obvious to those of us in the audience that the evolutionist simply lied to us. He had indeed received the information. And so it was clear that the evolutionist was suppressing the truth. Now, why? Why did he lie? Well, I believe he lied because when he got the information from the creationist, he understood there was nothing he could say to rebut this argument, but for professional and career reasons, he couldn't admit the creation was true, so again, he had to suppress the truth, and so he tried to distract us and confuse the issue by claiming that he had never gotten the information in the first place. Now again, why would he suppress the truth? Well, I believe that if he had admitted that creation was true, there would have been he would have lost some standing in the academic community. He may actually have lost his job, and so he had reasons like that to suppress the truth. And so that leads to the question, why in general do people suppress the truth? If indeed it is so obvious that God exists, why do people suppress the truth? Well, I think it has to do with freedom. We humans want to be free. We don't like the idea that there's a God out there who can tell us what to do. It also has to do with morality. We humans want to be free to define our own morality. Likewise with rules. We humans want to be free to make our own rules. We humans don't want to have to obey God. And we humans naturally want to be free to redefine marriage and gender if we prefer. And so these are some of the reasons why people suppress the truth about God, because ultimately we humans really are naturally inclined that we don't want to have to obey God. And so this ties in with what I mentioned much earlier. Does it matter if God exists? It has to do with limits. When we're asking if God exists, we're asking if there's a living, intelligent being out there who can place limits on humans. We're asking if there's a living, intelligent being out there who can tell humans what to do and bring consequences on humans who break God's rules. It has to do with danger. We're asking if there's a living, intelligent being out there who can kill humans at will. And it has to do with eternity. We're asking whether there is existence after life here on earth, and whether there is indeed a heaven and a hell. And again, we as humans, we don't want there to be a God who places limits or gives us rules or brings consequences or has the ability to kill us at will. And so that's why people tend to suppress the truth. So again, I mentioned, how do we know that God exists? And I use the example of a planetarium. When we walk into a planetarium and we see a lot of balls that move around in a regular, predictable pattern, the logical, intelligent conclusion is that a living, intelligent being created the planetarium. Likewise, when we look at the solar system, that is a collection of objects that move around in a regular, predictable pattern, and the logical, intelligent conclusion is that a living, intelligent being created the solar system. Likewise, planet Earth and a biosphere on the moon. If we would see a biosphere on the moon that has the right air and food and temperature for humans to live, we would conclude that a living, intelligent being created it. Likewise, when we look at the Earth, which has the right air mixture, the right temperature, and the right food supply for humans to live and work, the logical, intelligent conclusion is that there's a living being out there somewhere who created it. And likewise, when we look at an artificial hand that can write and throw and type, the logical, intelligent conclusion is that a living, intelligent being created that hand. And likewise, when we look at a real human hand that can throw, write, and type, the logical, intelligent conclusion is that a living, intelligent being created the human hand, which means that a living, intelligent being created humanity, which means that yes, indeed, there is a God.